The fleet that assembled at the rendezvous point was nothing like a proper military force, and Jake had never been more proud of anything in his life. 17 ships of various sizes and conditions floated in the shadow of a dead moon, and their crews represented every species that had reason to hate the hegemony. "That is Big Mira's hauler," Jake pointed out to Sareth as they surveyed the gathering. "She runs medical supplies to colonies the hegemony has blockaded, and next to her is the hollow point that our captain once smuggled 200 refugees out of a quarantine zone. They came because you asked," Sareth said, and there was wonder in her voice. "They came because it is the right thing to do," Jake corrected. "I just gave them a target." The plan was desperate and complicated, and relied on everything going exactly right, which meant it would probably fall apart within the first 10 minutes. But they had no other options, and Elder Marith was running out of time. "Remember," Jake addressed the assembled captains through the communication channel, "the fleet creates chaos and draws their defensive forces away from the station, and while they are distracted, Sareth and I go in through the maintenance shaft on the dark side. And if you get caught," Big Myra asked, "then we die and you all run," Jake said simply. "No heroic rescue attempts and no throwing lives away for nothing." "Understood," the captains replied in ragged unison. Jake closed the channel and turned to Sareth. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been ready since the day I watched my homeworld burn," she replied. "Today we either win or we join our ancestors, and either way the hegemony learns that we are not prey." The dusty spur slipped away from the fleet, and Jake piloted them through the debris field that surrounded the detention station. The facility was a black structure that bristled with weapons and sensor arrays, and it looked like something designed to crush. "Hope fleet is engaging," Sareth reported, and Jake saw the distant flashes of weapons fire as his makeshift armada descended on the hegemony patrol ships. The station's defenses turned outward to face the threat, and Jake pushed the dusty spur into the gap they created. "Maintenance shaft ahead," Sareth said. "I am reading 2 guards at the entrance." "Can you handle them quietly?" Jake asked. "Watch me," Sareth replied. They docked with barely a sound, and Sareth moved through the airlock like smoke made solid. Jake followed and found both guards unconscious on the floor, and Sareth cleaning her claws with casual precision. "You are terrifying," Jake observed. "Thank you," she replied. They moved through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and fear, and Jake followed the station schematics he had memorized while trying not to think about what happened in the rooms they passed. The detention block was deep in the station's core, and they encountered 4 more guards along the way, and each time Sareth dealt with them before Jake could even draw his weapon. "You could have escaped from my ship at any time," Jake realized. "Yes," Sareth agreed, "but I wanted to see what kind of human you were, and the answer was worth the wait." They reached the detention block, and Jake used his scrambler on the door lock, and the mechanism clicked open. Elder Marith hung in the center of a white room, and restraints held him suspended off the floor, and monitoring equipment surrounded him like hungry predators. He looked up as they entered, and his eyes widened with disbelief. "Sareth," he whispered. "How?" "Explanations later," Sareth said, and she was already working on his restraints. "Can you walk?" "I will manage," the elder replied. Jake checked his comm and heard the sounds of battle still raging outside. "Fleet is holding, but they are taking losses," he reported. "We need to move." They helped Elder Marith through the corridors, and his steps grew stronger as they went, but they were still too slow. An alarm blared suddenly, and Jake cursed. "They found the unconscious guard," Sareth said. "New plan." Jake decided, "I will draw them off, and you get the elder to the ship." "No," Sareth said firmly. "We stay together." "There is no time to argue," Jake said, and he pressed the dusty spur's remote activation key into her hand. "Get him home, Sareth, and tell the council I kept my promise." He ran before she could stop him and fired his weapon at a patrol approaching from a side corridor. The guards turned to pursue him, and Jake led them away from Sareth and Elder Marith. He ran through the station with no plan beyond survival, and the guards were gaining, and his lungs burned with effort. A door opened ahead of him, and Jake skidded to a stop as he found himself face to face with a hegemony commander in full armor. The bounty hunter, the commander said with cold satisfaction. "We were hoping you would try something stupid." "Happy to oblige," Jake replied. The commander raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a stream of flame erupted past Jake's shoulder and struck the commander square in the chest. Sareth stood behind Jake with Elder Marith leaning on her shoulder and fire still glowing in her throat. "I told you, we stay together," she said. They ran, and somehow they reached the ship, and somehow the fleet was still fighting, and somehow Jake piloted them through the chaos and into open space. The hegemony forces tried to pursue, but Big Myra's hauler cut them off with a barrage. That gave the Dusty Spur time to escape. "All ships disengage," Jake ordered. "Mission accomplished, and we are going home." The ragtag fleet scattered in 17 different directions, and the hegemony could not catch them all. Jake set course for the sanctuary and finally allowed himself to breathe. Elder Marith sat in the co-pilot seat and looked at Jake with ancient eyes. "They asked me where the sanctuary was," he said. "They used every technique they had, and I was about to break." "You did not," Jake said. "Because I knew someone was coming," the elder replied. "I did not know who or how, but I knew that we are not alone anymore." They reached the sanctuary as the artificial day dawned inside the asteroid, and the entire population turned out to welcome them home. Elder Marith was embraced by his family, and the council offered formal thanks, and the young Draconari, who had doubted Jake, nodded to him with respect. Sarah stood beside Jake as they watched the celebration. "You could have died today," she said. "So could you," Jake replied. "But here we are." "Here we are," she agreed. The council named Jake a friend of the Draconari people, and the title carried responsibilities and privileges that he was still learning to understand. But for now, he just wanted to stand in the artificial sunlight and watch people who had been hunted for generations finally feeling safe. "What happens now?" Sareth asked. "I have a supply run to plan," Jake said, "and routes to scout, and contacts to check, and probably a lot more impossible rescues in our future." "Our future," Sareth repeated. "Did I say our?" Jake asked, and he felt his face grow warm. "I meant the future, and generally speaking." Sareth made that sound that was definitely a laugh this time. "You are a strange human, Jake Yoon," she said. "And you are a terrifying dragon woman," Jake replied. "I guess we make a good team." Little Yura ran up to them and grabbed Jake's hand and tugged him toward the garden where other children waited. "Come play with us," she demanded. "You promised to teach us about cowboys." Jake looked at Sareth, and she nodded with something soft in her burning eyes. "Go," she said. "I will prepare the ship for your next run." "Our next run," Jake corrected. He let Yura drag him toward the garden, and behind him, he heard Sareth call out, "Jake." He turned, and she stood in the purple light of the sanctuary with her scales shimmering and her wings folded against her back. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." Jake tipped his worn leather hat in her direction. "I will always come back," he said. "That is what family does." Then he let a child of a dying species pull him into a game he did not understand, and he thought that maybe this was what he had been searching for all along. Not bounties or credits or a ship to call his own, but a place where he belonged. And people worth fighting for. The space cowboy had finally found his home among the dragons. The sanctuary's docking bay was carved from living rock, and the walls glowed with veins of luminescent crystal that cast everything in soft purple light. Jake stepped off his ship and found himself surrounded by Draconari who stared at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. "Stay close to me," Sareth murmured. Many here have never seen a human in person, and they have heard only stories of your kind helping the hegemony hunt us. Wonderful, Jake muttered back. Nothing like being the representative for all of humanity. The refugees from the station emerged behind him, and their appearance caused a ripple of excited voices through the crowd. Families rushed forward to embrace loved ones they had feared lost forever. And Jake watched reunions that made his chest tight with unexpected emotion. Elder Koroth was greeted by a female, who might have been his daughter, and she wept against his shoulder while he stroked her head with trembling hands. Little Yura stood alone until an older male pushed through the crowd and scooped her up, and she clung to him with desperate strength. Her uncle, Sereth, explained quietly. He has been searching for her since the raid. Jake nodded and felt something ease in his heart at seeing the child find family. A group of Draconari in formal robes approached, and the crowd parted for them with obvious respect. The council, Sereth said. They will decide what happens to you. The lead council member was a female whose scales had faded to silver with age, but whose eyes burned with fierce intelligence. I am High Keeper Talindra, she announced, and you have brought our people home, and for that we are grateful. But, Jake said, because he could hear the word coming. But you are human, Talindra continued, and humans have given us nothing but pain for 3 generations, and now you know the location of our sanctuary, and this creates a problem. I am not going to tell anyone, Jake said. You have my word. The word of a bounty hunter, another council member scoffed. A man who captures people for money. He freed us, one of the refugees called out. He risked his life when he had nothing to gain. Perhaps he seeks a different reward, the skeptical council member replied. Perhaps he intends to sell our location to the hegemony for a price beyond any bounty. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, but Sereth stepped forward before he could respond. I vouch for this human, she declared. He discovered the truth about the harvesting, and he chose conscience over profit, and without him 12 of our people would be dead. Your faith in him is noted, Talindra said, but we must think of all our people, and the risk is simply too great. What of it you propose? Sereth asked, and her voice carried a dangerous edge. He must remain here, Talindra said, permanently and as a guest, not a prisoner, but he cannot be allowed to leave with knowledge of our location. Jake looked at the council and then at the sanctuary around him, and he understood their fear even if he did not like it. What if I had another idea? He said. Talindra raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue. You need supplies, Jake said. I saw your ships in the docking. They are old, and none of them could pass through hegemony space without raising suspicion. We manage, Talindra said stiffly. You survive, Jake corrected. There's a difference, and I am a smuggler by trade, and I know routes and contacts, and ways to move through space without being seen. You are offering to become our supplier, Talindra said slowly. I am offering a partnership, Jake said. I bring you what you need, and you give me a purpose beyond chasing bounties and everybody. Benefits. The council murmured among themselves, and Jake waited while his fate was debated in a language he could not understand. And why should we trust that you will return? The skeptical council member demanded. What prevents you from simply flying away and selling us out? Nothing, Jake admitted, except that I have nowhere else to go, and the hegemony wants me dead now too, and like it or not, we are all in this together. Sereth stepped beside him, and her shoulder brushed against his in a gesture of support. I have seen this human's heart, she said. He is strange and reckless, and he plays terrible music, but there is honor in him. Terrible music, Jake whispered indignantly. We will discuss this further, Talindra announced. In the meantime, the human will be given quarters and treated as a guest. A young Draconari guided Jake through corridors carved from asteroid rock, and the walls were covered with paintings and carvings that told stories he could not read. His quarters were small but comfortable, and a window looked out into the hollow center of the asteroid, where a garden grew under artificial sunlight. He stood at that window for a long time and watched Draconari children playing among the plants, and their laughter echoed through the sanctuary. Sareth found him there as the artificial day cycled toward evening. "The council is still debating," she said, "but I think they will accept your proposal." "And if they do not," Jake asked, "then I will help you escape." Sareth said simply, "I owe you that much at least." Jake turned to look at her and saw something in her expression that he had not noticed before. "Why did you trust me?" he asked. "Back on the station when I opened your cell, and you had every reason to think it was a trap." Sareth was quiet for a moment, and the light from the garden painted shifting patterns on her scales. "When you looked at me, you did not see a monster or a prize," she said. "You saw a person and among humans that is rarer than you might think." "We are not all bad," Jake said. "No," Sareth agreed. "But your people have done terrible things to mine, and it would be easier to hate all of you than to admit that some deserve better." "The same could be said about any species," Jake offered, "including mine looking at yours." Sareth made that sound that might have been a laugh, and Jake found himself smiling. The next morning, a messenger summoned Jake to the council chamber, and he walked through corridors that had grown slightly more familiar. Talindra stood at the center of the chamber, and the other council members flanked her in a semicircle. "We have reached a decision," she announced. "Your proposal is accepted on a trial basis, and you will make supply runs under our direction and prove your loyalty through action." Jake nodded and felt relief wash through him. "However," Talindra continued, "we have received troubling news, and a scout ship returned this morning with word that the hegemony has captured one of our elders." The chamber went silent, and Jake saw fear ripple through the assembled Draconari. Elder Marith was intercepted while searching for other refugees. Talindra said, "He's being held at a hegemony detention facility for interrogation." Interrogation. The word fell from Jake's lips like a stone. "They will torture him for the sanctuary's location." "Elder Marith is strong," a council member said. "He will not break easily. Everyone breaks eventually." Jake replied, and he spoke from experience he wished he did not have. "We estimate 3 days before they extract the information." Talindra said, "After that the sanctuary will be compromised, and we will have to flee, and we have nowhere else to go." Jake looked at Sareth and saw the same thought forming in her eyes. "Then we have 3 days to get him out." Jake said, "Impossible," the skeptical council member declared. "One human in a smuggler ship cannot infiltrate a hegemony detention facility." "You are right," Jake agreed, "which is why I am not going alone." He turned to face the council fully and felt something click into place inside him. "I have contacts across this sector," he said. "Smugglers and outlaws and independent operators who owe me favors, and it is time to call them in." "You would rally criminals to save our people?" Talindra asked. "I would rally anyone willing to fight for the right side," Jake replied, "and in my experience, the people society calls criminals are sometimes the only ones willing to stand up when it matters." Sareth stepped forward, and her scales glowed with inner fire. "I am going with him," she announced. "Absolutely not," Talindra said. "You are too valuable to risk. My people do not ask others to take risks we will not share." Sareth replied, "Jake taught me that, and now I'm teaching it back to him." Jake met her eyes and saw determination that matched his own. 3 days, he said. "That is enough time to save the world or die trying." "That is not reassuring," Sareth observed. "It was not meant to be," Jake replied, and he grinned because the alternative was admitting how terrified he actually was. 3 days into the journey, and Jake's ship had transformed into something he barely recognized. The Dusty Spur was built for a crew of 2 at most, and now she carried 13 passengers through the most dangerous stretch of space Jake had ever Navigated Draconaris slept in shifts because there was not enough room for everyone to lie down at once, and they had turned his cargo hold into a communal living space with blankets, arranged in patterns that apparently held cultural significance. Jake stood in the galley trying to figure out how to stretch 3 days of food into 7 days of meals, and the math was not working in his favor. "You look troubled," Sarah said, and she had appeared behind him with that silent grace that still made him jump. "Just doing inventory," Jake replied. "And the inventory is telling me we might need to make a supply stop." "That would be dangerous," Sarah said. "The hegemony will have alerts on every station in this sector by now. Starving to death is also dangerous." Jake pointed out. Sarah moved beside him and examined the meager supplies, and her expression grew thoughtful. "My people can survive longer without food than humans," she said. "We will reduce our portions so that you have enough." "That is not how this works," Jake said firmly. "Everyone eats the same or nobody eats at all." Sarah studied him with an expression he could not read, and then she made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You continue to surprise me, human," she said. From the cargo hold, Jake heard the sound of his old music player crackling to life, and one of the Draconari had figured out how to operate it, and the ancient recording of a man singing about wide-open spaces filled the ship. "What is this noise?" Sarah asked. "Country music," Jake said. "Older stuff from before humans even left their home system, and my grandfather used to play it for me when I was young." "It sounds like someone in pain," Sarah observed. "That is kind of the point," Jake admitted. "Country music is about loss and longing and holding on to hope when everything seems lost." Sarah listened for a moment, and her head tilted in that curious way. She had, "Perhaps it is not so different from Draconari songs," she said. "We also sing about what we have lost." They walked together to the cargo hold, and Jake saw that the elderly male he had helped on the ramp was teaching the child. "You're some kind of game with small carved stones. That is Elder Koroth," Sarah explained. "He was once a keeper of our histories before the hegemony, burned our libraries, and scattered our people." "And the little girl?" Jake asked. "Yura is an orphan," Sarah said quietly. "Her parents were taken in a raid 2 years ago, and she has been passed from family to family ever since." Jake watched the old male patiently explaining the rules of the game, and Yura's face lit up with concentration and joy. "She seems happy now," Jake said. "Children are resilient," Sarah replied. "But she wakes screaming most nights and remembers things no child should have to remember." The music changed to a slower song about a cowboy riding into the sunset, and one of the younger Dragonari males approached Jake with cautious curiosity. "What is a cowboy?" he asked. The song mentions this word many times. Jake thought about how to explain and found himself smiling at the memory of old stories. "Cowboys were humans who lived on the frontiers of their world long ago," he said. "They rode animals called horses across open lands, and they lived by their own code of honor far from cities and laws. They sound like our ancestors." The young male said, "Before we built ships and reached the stars, our people roamed the great plains of our homeworld and followed the fire herds across the burning grasslands." "Maybe all species have their cowboys," Jake said. The ship shuddered suddenly, and Jake's instincts sent him running for the cockpit. "Sensor contact," he announced as he checked the displays. "Hegemony patrol, and they have not seen us yet, but they will if we stay on this course." Sarah joined him and examined the tactical readout with practiced eyes. "Can we go around them?" she asked. "It would add 2 days to our journey," Jake said, "and we do not have food for 2 extra days." "What about hiding?" Sarah suggested. "You mentioned this ship has hidden compartments. For cargo, not for people," Jake said. "And hegemony scanners are good enough to detect life signs even through shielded walls." They both stared at the display and watched the patrol ship moving in a search pattern. "Wait," Yura's small voice came from behind them. I see something. Jake turned and found the child standing in the cockpit doorway, and she pointed at a section of the sensor display. There is a shadow behind the big ship, she said. Another ship hiding in their sensor wake. Jake looked where she pointed, and at first he saw nothing, but then he noticed a faint distortion. She had spotted. That is a smuggler trick, he said with growing excitement. Another ship is using the patrol's own sensors to mask their presence. Can we do the same? Sarah asked. If I can match their course perfectly and stay in the blind spot, Jake said. It is risky, but it beats the alternatives. He looked at Yura and felt genuine admiration for her sharp eyes. Good catch, little one, he said. You might have just saved us all. Yura beamed with pride, and Sareth placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. Jake flew the most careful approach of his life and matched the patrol ship's course with millimeter precision, and they rode in the shadow of their enemy for 6 tense hours when the patrol finally turned away and left them alone. Jake let out a breath that felt like it had been building for days. We are through the worst of it, he said. Another day, and we reached the coordinates you gave me. Sareth nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Jake, she said. And it was the first time she had used his name without adding human afterward. What will you do after you deliver us to the sanctuary? Jake had not thought that far ahead, and he realized he had no answer. I suppose I will figure something out, he said. I always do. You will be wanted by the hegemony, Sareth said. Your face will be on every bounty board in the galaxy, and the life you knew is over. That life was not much to begin with, Jake admitted, chasing scared people across the stars and pretending it made me something other than a man running from his own past. Sareth was quiet for a long moment, and the only sound was the hum of the engines and the distant murmur of Draconari voices from the cargo hold. My people have a saying, she finally said. The fire that burns away the old forest makes room for new growth. We have a similar saying on Earth, Jake replied. Every ending is a new beginning. Sareth nodded slowly, and something passed between them that felt like understanding. The next day they reached the coordinates, and Jake saw nothing but empty space and distant stars. There is nothing here, he said. Sareth moved to the communication console and spoke a phrase in ancient Draconari, and her voice carried a melody that sounded more like singing than speaking. For a moment nothing happened, and then the stars in front of them shimmered and rippled, and a massive structure appeared from nowhere. It was an asteroid that had been hollowed out and converted into a station, and lights glowed from hundreds of windows carved into the rock, and ships of Draconari design clustered around docking ports. Welcome to the last refuge of my people, Sareth said. You are the first human to ever see it. Jake stared at the hidden sanctuary and understood the weight of the trust she had placed in him. It is beautiful, he said honestly. It is home, Sareth replied. The holding cell smelled like rust and fear, and Jake Yoon had grown used to both during his years as a bounty hunter. He stood outside the reinforced glass and watched his latest capture with careful eyes, and she watched him right back without any sign of weakness or shame. Her name was Sareth Voss, and she belonged to a species called the Draconari, and Jake had never seen anything quite like her in all his travels across the outer territories. She stood nearly 7 feet tall with scales that shimmered between deep purple and black depending on how the light touched them, and her eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed almost literal, and 2 vestigial wings folded against her back like a cape made of leather and bone. The bounty on her head could buy Jake a new ship and enough fuel to last 3 years, and the Hegemony Collective wanted her badly for terrorism charges that carried a death sentence. Jake adjusted his worn leather hat and leaned against the wall of Waypoint Sigma, and this station existed in the space between laws where bounty hunters and criminals and desperate people all mixed together in an uneasy truce. You keep staring at me, human, Sarah said, and her voice carried a strange resonance like distant thunder rolling across mountains. Making sure you are still there. Jake replied, and he kept his tone light, but his hand stayed near his sidearm out of habit. I am not going anywhere, she said, and a hint of dark humor colored her words. Your restraints are quite effective, and I must admit the hegemony taught humans well in the art of building cages. Jake frowned at that comment but said nothing, and he had learned long ago that prisoners often tried to get inside your head with strange remarks and manipulation. The station around them hummed with activity as other hunters processed their own catches and traders moved cargo through the massive docking bays, and somewhere in the distance, a drunk spacer sang a song about a girl he left on Mars. Do you know what happens to Draconari prisoners when the hegemony takes custody of them? Sareth asked suddenly, and her burning eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Prison, I assume, Jake said. Same as any other criminal. You assume wrong, Sareth said, and she pressed one clawed hand against the glass that separated them. But I wonder if the truth would matter to a man who trades lives for credits. Jake pushed himself off the wall and turned to walk away because he had heard enough manipulation attempts to recognize one when it started. Sleep well, bounty hunter, Sareth called after him. And when you learn what your credits are truly buying, perhaps you will understand why I did what I did. Jake kept walking and told himself that her words meant nothing and that every criminal had excuses and justifications for their actions. He found a corner booth in the station cantina and ordered a drink that tasted like engine fuel mixed with regret, and the place was crowded with the usual collection of rough faces and suspicious eyes. 2 station officials sat at a nearby table, and they spoke in low voices, but the cantina had gone quiet enough that Jake caught fragments of their conversation. Hegemony ship arrives tomorrow morning, one of them said. They want the dragon woman processed and ready for immediate transfer. Another one for the harvest, the second official replied, and he laughed in a way that made Jake feel cold. Those fire glands fetch quite a price on the weapons market. Jake felt his stomach turn, and he set down his drink and listened more carefully. The whole species is almost dried up, the first official continued. Maybe a few thousand left, hiding somewhere, but the hegemony will find them eventually, and then the harvest will be complete. Good riddance, I say, the second one added. Dangerous creatures, those Draconari, and the galaxy is better off with them gone, and their organs powering our defense systems. Jake stood up slowly and left the cantina, and his mind raced with what he had just heard. Harvest did not mean prison, and it did not mean trial or justice of any kind. It meant murder, and it meant butchering sentient beings for their body parts, and it meant that the terrorism charges against Sareth were probably nothing more than lies designed to justify genocide. He walked back toward the holding cells and past other prisoners who called out to him with threats and pleas, and he ignored them all until he reached Sareth. She looked up at him, and her expression showed no surprise, as if she had expected him to return. You heard something, she said, and it was not a question. Tell me what you did, Jake demanded. Tell me what they call terrorism. Sareth rose to her full height, and her scales caught the harsh light and threw it back in fragments of purple and silver. I destroyed a harvesting facility, she said, a place where my people were taken apart, while still alive, because the glands produce more efficiently when the donor remains conscious during extraction. Jake felt sick, and he gripped the edge of a nearby console to steady himself. I freed 47 Draconari from that facility, Sareth continued, men and women and children who'd have died screaming on operating tables, and for that crime, the hegemony has hunted me across 6 star systems. Why did you not tell me this before? Jake asked. Would you have believed me? Sareth replied, humans trust the hegemony because the hegemony has made itself useful to your kind, and my words would have seemed like desperate lies from a condemned prisoner. She was right, and Jake knew it, and he hated that she was right. There are others, Sarah said, 11 more Draconari in this station, waiting for the same ship that comes for me. And tomorrow, we will all be taken to the same fate. Jake looked at the keycard in his hand, and he had pulled it from his belt without even thinking about it. You could still collect your bounty, Sarah said quietly. I would not blame you for choosing survival over conscience, and humans are practical creatures after all. Jake thought about his ship and the credits he needed and the life he had built chasing bounties across the galaxy. Then he thought about 47 people being cut apart while they screamed. And he thought about a whole species being erased from existence for profit. Where are the other cells, he asked. Sarah blinked, and for the first time since he had captured her, Jake saw genuine surprise cross her alien features. You would truly do this, she asked. You would sacrifice everything you have for people you do not know. Lady, I have been running from myself for a long time, Jake said, and he pressed the keycard against the lock. Maybe it is time. I stopped running and started doing something worth remembering. The cell door slid open with a soft hiss, and Sarah stepped through, and she moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her size. The other cells are in Section 7, she said, but we will need a plan because the guards change shifts in 20 minutes. Jake checked his weapon and settled his hat more firmly on his head and allowed himself a small grin. Planning is for people with options, he said. We have got 20 minutes and 12 prisoners to free in a hegemony ship coming in the morning. Sarah studied him with those burning eyes, and something shifted in her expression, and it might have been respect or it might have been hope. You are either very brave or very foolish human, she said. Probably both, Jake admitted. Now let us go commit some terrorism. Section 7 smelled worse than the cell block where Jake had kept. Sarah and the air carried something sour and desperate that clung to his skin. They moved through maintenance corridors that Jake knew from years of delivering prisoners to this station, and Sarah followed close behind him, with her clawed feet barely making sound on the metal grating. How do you know these passages? She whispered. I spent 6 months living in the walls of this station when I was younger, Jake replied. Back when I had no ship and no credits and nothing but stubbornness to keep me alive. They reached the junction, and Jake held up his hand and listened to the footsteps of a guard passing on the level above them. The cells are through that door, Jake said, but there will be at least 2 guards inside and probably more. I can handle guards, Sarah said, and her claws extended slightly, and Jake noticed the faint glow building in her throat. No killing, unless we have no choice, Jake said firmly. Dead guards bring investigations, and investigations bring hegemony attention faster than anything else. Sarah looked at him with curiosity, and her head tilted in a way that reminded Jake of a bird examining something strange. You hunt people for money, but you hesitate to kill, she observed. You are a confusing creature, Jake Yoon. I catch people who break laws, Jake said. Some of those laws are stupid, and some of the people are innocent, but killing guards, just doing their jobs, is not something I can live with. He pulled a small device from his belt and pressed it against the door lock, and the device hummed for 3 seconds before the lock clicked open. Electromagnetic scrambler, Jake explained. Another gift from my years of being poor and desperate. The door slid open, and they stepped into the holding area, and Jake saw immediately that the situation was worse than he expected. 3 guards stood in the center of the room, and 11 cells lined the walls. And behind the reinforced glass, Jake could see Draconari prisoners in various states of despair. One guard turned at the sound of the door, and his hand moved toward his weapon, but Sarah was faster. She crossed the distance in 2 strides, and her fist connected with the guard's helmet, and the impact sent him crashing into his companions, and all 3 went down in a tangle of limbs and armor. Jake winced at the noise, but pulled out his keycard and started opening cells. Move quickly, and quietly, he told the emerging prisoners. We have maybe 10 minutes before someone notices the guards are not responding to check-ins. The Draconari stumbled out of their cells, and they looked at Jake with expressions that mixed fear and confusion. And desperate hope, an elderly male with faded scales and clouded eyes, grabbed Jake's arm. "Why would a human help us?" he asked, and his voice cracked with emotion. "What do you want from us? Right now I want you to move your tail toward the docking bay." Jake said, "We can discuss philosophy later when we are not about to be captured." Sareth helped the elder stand straight, and she spoke to him in a language Jake did not understand, and whatever she said made the old male nod slowly. "This way," Jake said, and he led them back into the maintenance corridors. They moved as fast as the weakest among them could manage, and that was not nearly fast enough for Jake's comfort. A young Draconari female carried a child on her back, and the child watched Jake with wide golden eyes that seemed too large for her small face. "What is your name, human?" the child asked in a tiny voice. "Jake," he replied. "And you should probably stay quiet, little one." "My name is Yura," the child continued as if he had not spoken. "Are you taking us somewhere safe?" Jake thought about his ship and the journey ahead, and the hegemony forces that would soon be hunting them across every sector of known space. "I'm going to try," he said honestly. They reached the docking level, and Jake could see his ship at the far end of the bay, and the Dusty Spur was not pretty, but she was fast, and she had hidden compartments that had fooled customs inspectors more times than Jake could count. "There," he pointed. "The brown freighter with the crooked antenna, and we need to get everyone aboard before the shift change." They were halfway across the docking bay when the alarm started screaming. Red lights flashed, and a voice announced that there was a security breach in Section 7, and all personnel should report to stations immediately. "Run!" Jake shouted. The Draconari needed no encouragement, and they sprinted toward the ship with Jake and Sareth bringing up the rear. A squad of station guards appeared at the far entrance, and they raised their weapons, and Jake heard the whine of charging energy cells. "Get down!" Sareth roared, and she stepped in front of the fleeing prisoners, and her mouth opened and a stream of fire erupted from her throat. The flames did not reach the guards, but they forced them to dive for cover, and that was all the time the refugees needed. Jake reached the ship and slammed his palm against the entry panel, and the ramp dropped down, and he started pushing Draconari inside. "Move, move, move," he shouted. Sarah stood at the base of the ramp and kept the guards pinned with bursts of flame, and Jake noticed that she was careful not to hit anyone directly. The elderly male stumbled on the ramp, and Jake caught him before he could fall and half carried him into the ship. "Everyone inside," Jake called, and he did a quick count, and 11 prisoners plus. Sareth made 12. She backed up the ramp while still facing the guards, and Jake hit the control to raise the ramp behind her. "Strap in if you can find something to strap into," Jake shouted as he ran for the cockpit. "This is going to be rough." He threw himself into the pilot's seat, and his hands flew across the controls, and the engines roared to life with a sound that had never been more beautiful to his ears. The station tried to lock down the docking clamps, but Jake had already initiated emergency release, and the Dusty Spur tore free with a shriek of stressed metal. "They are launching pursuit craft," Sareth said, and she had appeared in the cockpit doorway. "I see them," Jake replied, and he pushed the throttle forward and felt the ship leap toward open space. 3 station security vessels fell in behind them, and their weapons started charging for a disabling shot. "There," Jake pointed at the sensor display. "Asteroid field about 2 minutes out, and they cannot follow us in there with ships that size." "Can we survive an asteroid field?" Sareth asked. "Guess we will find out," Jake said, and he grinned despite the terror pumping through his veins. The first shots from the pursuit craft missed wide, and Jake threw the ship into a spinning evasion pattern that made Sareth grabbed the doorframe for support. "You fly like a madman," she observed. "Thank you," Jake replied. The asteroid field loomed ahead, and Jake did not slow down, and he threaded the needle between 2 spinning rocks and heard the pursuit craft break off rather than follow. They were not safe yet, but they were. Free and Jake let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Where do we go now?" he asked. Sareth was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her wrestling with something important. "There is a place," she finally said. "A sanctuary where white people have hidden for 3 generations, and no outsider has ever been told its location." She looked at Jake with those burning eyes, and he saw the weight of what she was about to do. "I am trusting you with the last hope of my species, Jake." "Yoon," she said, "do not make me regret it." Jake nodded slowly and understood that this was bigger than a simple prison break. "Tell me where to fly," he said, "and I will get us there.